I certainly do pay a lot of attention to longer term things. I spend as much time reading about public policy and reading about what's happening in governments, both here and around the globe, because that impacts all of our agriculture on a day-to-day basis. And I think when you talk to farmers, that's one of their biggest interests is, obviously they're worried about price and interested in price, but they're also very concerned about what's happening around the globe and how that's going to impact them.
Welcome to Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag. We got a good one today. I'm your host, Tom Versman, brand manager for Bayer, but I'm going to pass it over to Julie and have her introduce herself as well.
Hi, so I'm Julie. I am a content marketing specialist on FieldView. And today on Around the Farm, we have a very special guest. So, Steve, I think you might have been on more episodes than myself or Tom. But
very
first,
possible.
For some of the listeners, could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. So I'm Steve Nicholson. I'm the global sector strategist for grains and oilseeds for Rabo Bank. I'm based here in St. Louis. My background is 15 years of procurement for Fortune 500 food companies, grain trading, merchandising. And when I first got out of undergraduate school, I spent some time in research analysis for a private company. And I have a little politics in my background, worked for a member of Congress many moons ago. Back when, as I tell people, that's when politics was fun. It's not as much fun now.
Politics was fun.
Yeah.
That's great. I did Google you, Steve, before, because we hadn't met in person, right? But I saw Coca-Cola was a big part of your past too, which I thought was pretty neat. I didn't know if you had anything fun to add there.
So out of graduate school, I got a job at Coca-Cola as a commodity analyst. The reality of the job was I was the corn buyer. So I bought all the corn for high fructose corn syrup used in North America by Coca-Cola, which is a lot of corn. And it was, let's just say it was more than a few thousand bushels a day.
That's cool. You know, Steve, one of the things I know you've talked about, especially during COVID back in 2020, was, hey, we're in this COVID decade now, or maybe even moving forward, this COVID century, whatever we want to call it. But you know, what are some of the things you said back in 2020 and maybe some of those predictions or things you thought about? And, you know, how's it going today? We're in 24. What was right? What did you not expect? I mean, what surprised you? All the fun stuff that come with it.
So we had several interesting questions. After COVID, we had questions from bankers, particularly in the wholesale side of the bank, who would say, well, what are farmers going to do? I said, well, farmers are going to plant corn or they're going to plant soybeans. That's not going to change. They're the ultimate socially distanced
right
out there.
That's right.
So that was the one thing we said that was going to happen, and that did happen. There was a lot of concern, as you can expect, about the supply chain, and grain finding its way, trading. How's that going to work? And we said, well, that's probably not going to change very much because people are still going to eat. And one of the things we certainly did see a slowdown. We saw a disruption in that supply chain. But I think the one thing that surprised me during that, because there were so many dire predictions about that supply chain corrected itself and got back in line very, very quickly. And I think that was a good lesson we learned. Grain is like water. It will find its vein and it will flow. I think we were also a little bit surprised of how high grain prices did get. COVID certainly didn't help that, but it was, you got to the end of 2020 and they took off because the demand side was so strong. And I think that was the other thing we weren't quite sure as how the demand side would be, but people were so concerned about supply chains that they front-loaded or brought a lot of demand forward because they wanted to have supply in hand. I think the one thing we haven't really seen is we thought people would hold on to more inventory, and that doesn't seem to be like people are holding on to much more inventory. They're back to their same patterns of coverage out in front of them.
Oh, that makes total sense, and appreciate you sharing there. One of the other things I know we touched on too was, just chit-chatting here before we started recording, maybe even some of the prices in the supermarkets and, how the economy maybe got a little inflated with the stimulus packages and, we were just having a good conversation. But I didn't know if you had anything to add there too.
Yeah, I mean, probably for our listeners, maybe talk about that. And you think about what happened during COVID and you had kind of two huge stimulus packages. First, of course, the Trump administration put a big COVID package, which put in billions of dollars into the economy, and people got checks in the mail. And then you also had the Federal Reserve take interest rates basically back to zero. And so that also added stimulus to the economy. And then after the 2020 election, when the Biden administration came in, they put in another COVID package that came out the door. And so that, again, put money back in the consumers' pockets. And then you had two major packages come through. You had the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act. So you had that, which put money in the economy for lots of different things, a lot of it around clean energy, around climate change sort of things. But you also had to think about the big stimulus for chip manufacturing. That's billions of dollars coming in the economy as well. So you had an economy that was overstimulated. You had the consumer who had been locked up for 2 years. And I don't mean that badly, but was locked up for 2 years and had a lot of pent-up demand. So they had this money they had to spend, or they wanted to spend.
To spend.
Yeah, you know how people get money in their pocket and burns a hole in their pocket. Right. So there was all this pent-up demand, and so you had the classic definition of inflation. You had more money chasing less goods because the supply chain wasn't quite fixed then. I mean, we still think about what happened. You still had ships off Long Beach trying to unload containers, and we're still dealing with that today in the sense of there's still a lot of demand, and we were just talking before we recorded, over the 4th of July weekend here, I think this is the right number. TSA said they had cleared 3 million people through security, which is like the 6th or 7th highest on record. That's just crazy. If people think the economy's bad, it's hard to believe that when you see that many people traveling on planes, which are expensive.
Following that, you touched on the 2020 election, right? And the resulting IRA. We're once again in an election year, right?
Yes, we are.
Yeah. And so I was wondering, what are the hot topics that you're keeping an eye on, right? What are like the policies? And are there anything raising red flags or something to watch?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. Obviously, the Farm Bill it's not done. I don't know at this point. It depends a little if it drags over into next year, what the composition of the Congress will be, and so will there be some changes there? Obviously, there's a lot of concern about the cost of crop insurance. There's a lot of concern, of course, about the cost of SNAP. So there, depending on how Congress is and who gets the White House, how that could come out. So I think we all need to be watching that.
Shifting gears here a little bit too, Julie, I know one thing you and I both are passionate about is technology, and both being a part of climate, and that shout out to sponsored by Climate FieldView, right? Make sure we get plugged there.
Absolutely.
But how is technology transforming agriculture and the industry, and what innovations are you looking at as farmers move forward?
Yeah, so like our day-to-day lives, whether you're in a city or whether in rural areas, technologies, transform everything we do. We don't have our phones on the table, but you think about all the power you have on that phone is more than we had likely probably in the Gemini program when we started, going to space.
Or the Apollo program. Which is even more wild to think about.
Think about it, yeah, that you got to the moon and back and didn't have the same power we have probably in our hand today. When I think about a lot of course, revolves around GPS, revolves around the technology of satellites and understand what's happening in that field. We go a little deeper. It's all about the soil in my mind. And that's the thing that we're focused on. What are you doing in that soil? How do you get that soil to be make more nutrients available to the plant? And I know this gets a little close to home and maybe cut close to the bone, but what do you do to reduce the amount of fertilizer or the amount of chemistry that you use in that ground so that you don't have to use as much money? And I think that's the piece that we have to remember. And it's a discussion we have all the time because people talk about sustainability. And I say, okay, that's fine. That's the last time I use that word. But let's talk about this as practical on the ground. What do you do to make sure that ground, that soil is as healthy as it can be or as resilient as it can be and provide the nutrients the plant needs to produce, whether it's corn or soybeans or wheat or cotton or whatever the crop is. So as a grain and oilseeds person, and when I think about the team, that's what we're trying to focus on, is to think about what do we do? And farmers who are doing this understand that can reduce their cost of production, which is absolutely critical, particularly as we see prices come down.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, we talk a lot about what you can do to optimize inputs, right?
Yep,
and then
exactly.
Also, and then good stewardship of the soil, right? Like what kind of practices that you can experiment with. Yeah, and I think that's a huge emerging trend and opportunity on the farm.
I absolutely agree with you 100%. And I think when the farm input companies are thinking about that, and Bayer I know is, and talking to your leadership over the last couple of years, is that things are changing and your business is changing. And what do you do now to help the farmer do exactly what you described, Julie? And I think that's where our focus is as well, because that's what matters.
What role do you see for alternative crops or diversification in a farmer strategy given current market conditions?
Well, first of all, a big opportunity. You think about corn and soybeans, and there are producers who are really good at that, and they can make money in almost any price environment. And so for those guys, those are the guys and gals who should continue to do that because they're very efficient at it. Having said that, in this environment of sustainability, in this, whether it's climate change or whether it's sustainable to farm, whatever the case might be, and the fact that there are people who want different types of crops to eat different things, those are opportunities I think we have to think about. There's organics, obviously, but then you start to think about beans, you think about legumes and pulses, those are opportunities. You also have to think about what are the opportunities on the sustainability side or soil health is keeping that soil active year round and planting those crops on a year round basis, whether it's rye, whether it's oats, whether it's some other legume, those are opportunities that are out there that are both good for your bottom line and also good for your soil. And I think that's a big mindset because I grew up in Iowa, and I always joke we plant 4 crops in Iowa: corn, soybeans, soybeans, corn. Probably should be soybeans, corn, soybeans. But, we plant 4 crops, and it's got to be pretty monoculture. And, I remember growing up, my uncle he had peas in the farm, he had wheat in the farm,
Sure.
corn, soybeans, he had hogs, he had cattle, he had everything in the farm. And that farm today is basically corn and soybeans only. And I'm not being critical of that, and I'm not putting that down, but I think the diversity of crops on the farm, both from a revenue perspective and opportunity, and also for the soil, also helps the disease, also helps with pests. And I think there's a lot can be said for that, biodiversity in the ground or on the farm.
What about, when you think of that even to adding things in like carbon that
Right.
we're doing today. So that kind of changes things up a bit too.
Right, because you need something different. You're not going to be turning the soil over more, so you need some different plants in that soil to break that soil up, open that soil up for whether it's water, whether it's oxygen, or whether it's nutrients. And so all those things come together, and that's really important. And then you see people who people talk about the regenerative agriculture, and I understand that, and you kind of I've said jokingly to farm audiences, and I said, these are things. There's nothing new in this story of regenerative agriculture. It's just new words. Like I just talked about my uncle. You look across farms in Iowa, and when I was growing up, everybody had livestock and everybody had crops. And that manure went back, and you saw that rotation, if you have it, or that circular of the farm, and we've gotten away from that. And so there is obviously some opportunities there, but I also think it's opportunities for farmers to work together, because you look if you have a livestock production and it's large, you may not have as much cropland because your focus is on the livestock. So can you sell that manure into a crop farmer who needs that for fertilizer, which is going to decrease his carbon intensity of that crop, but also increase the carbon in the soil.
Right.
So there are opportunities there, and we just have to think different. And particularly when you think about, I'm going to go down a little different rabbit trail if you don't mind.
Love it.
But if you think about one of the strengths of Brazil is now it's a different climate and different soils though too, but they produce 2 crops a year on that hectare of ground. So their revenue stream is different, it's stronger, and they're able to do that because they have 2 crops. We've gotten away from that, and I understand that the climate's different, but you look at some of our areas, we can likely produce 2 crops, we just have to work at it.
Yeah, no, it would be quite interesting if we,
Oh my goodness.
I mean, if you think of Iowa, right? If you could do 2 crops in Iowa, that'd be wild.
The productive value of that soil, and as that ground gets more expensive, you have more financing of that soil, of that ground. So 2 revenues would make a huge difference.
And maybe, we were talking about, advances in technology. Who knows? Maybe one day, I guess that's one we didn't think about. That could be on the table. Who knows?
Well, there's an opportunity for Bayer. Make a crop that is a little more tolerant of a longer or a different, on the front end, with a little colder temperatures, or a little colder temperatures on the back end in the fall. So, I mean, there's a genetic opportunity for somebody. So,
Frost stacks.
There you go.
You heard it here.
Yeah.
Frostex, there you go. So there's a lot of opportunities out there, and I think the farmers who are thinking ahead and thinking about what do they do to make that operation both soil healthier, economically sustainability, also sustainable for their family, over the generations. And we know that's really where the farmer's head is to move that farm to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, is there anything we didn't cover that you think that we really ought to?
Yeah, I think it's good we talk a little bit about price and talk a little bit about what's ahead for producers. Mm-hmm. It's been a tough week in markets. So we'll just say that up front as we record this after the 4th of July. I think the word I'm using is we're back kind of in the doldrums, and prices. We sit here today and it's raining in St. Louis, and it's raining across parts of the Corn Belt, and I've bid as our vacation. I got to see lots of Illinois, parts of Indiana, and lots of Michigan. Corn looked tremendous. And I would say we're going to be building stocks on corn this year. Unless Mother Nature turns the faucet off and turns 100 degrees, we could have a very good crop coming forward when we look at corn. Soybeans tough right now. It looks a little ragged out there, but soybeans, chances are we probably will produce soybeans considering the weather if the weather continues. So I think producers have to be willing to let go when they see that rally and not hope that we're going to see that $5 again on corn.
Yep.
You almost have to be more judicious in your marketing now than you did before. And when you see that opportunity, you have to take it and move on. And also remember, you have to get 2 bites of the apple. You have basis levels to deal with, and basis values or basis levels to deal with, and you have futures to deal with. So you don't have to price the whole thing, but you have to be very judicious here because the market is telling you that we don't want the corn or the soybeans now. We're in a carry. It's also telling you we don't really care what the price is, and the market's everyone has gone to the berry side, which is a little bit of the silver line is that we could potentially see an uptick pretty fast. Been a lot of money that's gone into the berry side of the market, and that could change if something changes fast. But when you have a 2 billion bushel carryover on corn and a building carryover on soybeans, the market's going to go, so much. Yeah, we could have a little bit of a drought. We'll be okay because we have a cushion. And that's something we haven't had for the last 3 or 4 years is a cushion. And now we have a cushion, and the market's going to go, yeah, we can have a little problem. It's not going to be a big deal. We don't feel like we have to put. And there's no risk premium in this market right now. So that's the other silver lining is that if something goes wrong, there's no risk premium. The market will have to react to that very quickly. But the cushion of the stocks will make a difference. So farmers need to be paying attention just because prices are down and it's depressing. I get it.
That's right.
Be conscious and understand what's happening around you because there may be opportunities that you might get and you want to be ready to take advantage of them.
Yep. So be aware of those opportunities and pay attention.
Absolutely.
Pretty simple. Pretty simple thought.
Yeah. Understand what it costs you to produce that crop.
That's right. What's your insight on down south in Brazil?
Great question. I think Brazil, it's going to be interesting what happens this year. If you look at the crop that the corn crop they're just harvesting or just finished harvesting, the soybean crop we just finished, you saw about a 2.25% increase in harvested acres in Brazil for soybeans this past year. And I'm sure you've seen that on your sales side. But you saw corn acres down. You did not see harvested acres are down about the same amount, 2.5%. So where we're a corn country, we plant corn. That's what we do. They're a soybean country, and they will plant soybeans first. And if the corn margins, and they've been squeezed there just like us, they will pull back on corn and not spend that money to plant the corn crop. And so I think there's a potential, as we look into 25, I think that's where we have to think about if corn margins are bad, here in the U.S. and in Brazil, you could see a little bit of a pullback in corn supply and maybe see a little bit better situation when we look at corn prices because Brazil potentially could plant less. And then you also could see the U.S. farmer go, you know what, I did that last year and I had negative margins going in and I didn't like it. I'm not going to do that again, so I'll pull back a little bit on corn. Maybe I planted a little more soybeans. Maybe they'll plant a different crop like we talked earlier. So you could see a little bit of a pullback in production in 25 and therefore maybe see stocks come down a little bit. But I think Brazil will be interesting.
All right. So now getting more into keeping up with trends. Are you reading anything good lately? Any good book or resources you recommend for farmers?
Oh, gosh. Agriculturally, I'm probably not reading anything particularly agriculture, but I certainly do pay a lot of attention to kind kind of the longer term things. I spend as much time reading about public policy and reading about what's happening in governments, both here and around the globe, because that impacts all of our agriculture on a day-to-day basis. And I think when you talk to farmers, that's one of their biggest interests is, obviously they're worried about price and interested in price, but they're also very concerned about what's happening around the globe and how that's going to impact them.
Does your team have a podcast for farmers looking to keep tabs on grain marketing?
Well, thank you for that plug. Yes, we have one podcast, but it has two different kind of components to it. So we do a North American podcast twice a quarter. So it's on the bookends of the months of the quarter. And then the middle of that quarter, so it would be, we do a global podcast. And so I get the whole global team together. And so that includes folks from Brazil, China, Australia, Europe, and North America. And also Singapore, Southeast Asia. And so we talk about everything from palm oil to grain and oilseeds, corn, soybeans, wheat, what's happening in China as far as the economy, which has been a big topic of late, and obviously talk about in Australia what's happening there, because there's been a lot of changes there in their weather, and they're going through that. So we do that in the middle of the quarter. So
what is it called, and where can listeners find it?
Right now, it's just called the North American Grain and Oilseeds Podcast. If you go to any of your podcast providers, Google Rabobank or North American Rabobank, and you'll find it there.
All right, sounds good.
It's one of those things that anywhere you can get different information, learn about what's going on in the market, learn about what's going on in agriculture, and get all the perspectives and bring them together is really powerful.
It's one of the things I've emphasized to the team. I said, we need to bring a global perspective.
Yep. I
wake up every day and look at the newspaper and say, okay, what happened around the world overnight while I was asleep that's going to impact the markets today?
No, that's awesome. Do you look at the newspaper still, or do you pull your phone out? Just curious. Not to put you on the spot.
No, I do both. I would love to be able to get the papers, and I could sit there and read the Post-Dispatch. I would read the Des Moines Register, which is my hometown newspaper.
Sure.
I would love to read the Washington Post, but I don't. But I do read the New York Times, and I do read the Economist. Those are all things I read daily and weekly to see what's happening around the globe, because that's really important for me, particularly in this new role as a global sector strategist.
No, that's awesome. Appreciate you sharing
but
that.
I do like
the physical.
I do
the
like
smell and the touch of the paper.
I do like a physical newspaper. It's not quite the same.
Yep.
So for farmers out there who are reading different news sources, how can they make sense of the different conflicting messages that they might be hearing?
Yeah, it's a good question. We all deal with that every day. So, we do the same thing. When you think about news, I'm very cautious about just taking any news at face value unless it's, a vetted editorial paper or publication, so that that there is an editor, there's someone who goes through it, and there's a fact checker to make sure that this all makes sense. Commentary is commentary, and we have to remember that. Not that it's bad or good, it's just commentary. The other thing is you have to have trusted people in your life. And so you think about a farmer, maybe they have, maybe it's their seed salesperson. Maybe they have a crop advisor. Potentially a broker, but make sure you have someone that you trust and that you have a good rapport with. Maybe it's your grain merchandiser at the local elevator at the port or the terminal. Make sure you have those trusted people in front of you, and that you have a good relationship, and you can have that a conversation on a regular basis. That's the other thing is, don't always go to them when something goes wrong or something goes right. Let's be both sides of that. That needs to be an ongoing relationship and an ongoing conversation, because that helps you get a context and helps them get a context about you, and you understand what's going on. So it's a great question, and it's a tough question. And in this day and age, it's tougher because we're bombarded from so many different sources. You just have to stop and slow it down a little bit and decide what's valid, what's not, what's important to you and what's not. And that's the other thing. Prioritize what's important to you. If you're good at something, then you focus on it. And if you're not very good at that, and farmers will argue about, I'm not a very good marketer, some of them are better than others, and I think they'll recognize that. Get some help to do that. Find out who is that good person for you, and put them to work for you.
No, I appreciate you sharing that, Steve. And hey, a big thank you for joining us today. And one more time, plug your podcast again, because I don't want to butcher it. I know you're rebranding it, but I don't want to butcher it.
So it's North American Podcast Series for Rabo AgriFinance or Rabobank. And if you go to your podcast supplier and put that in the search bar, that's where you'll put in Rabobank or North American Rabo AgriFinance or Rabobank. You'll find it. It'll pop up.
That's awesome. No, thank you.
Thank you.
And hey, I also want to thank our listeners. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like, follow, subscribe. Once again, this has been Around the Farm, sponsored by Climate FieldView. Don't miss any of our episodes. You can find us wherever you get podcasts today. And as always, we'll see you around the farm.